It would be interesting to me to hear whether or not you guys, who, of course, were quite young in 1992, what kind of decision you would have made then and what kind of decision you'd make now, and whether or not those, the technology that has changed since then affects our decision-making on these kinds of journalistic values. I realize I do have some insights about being an entrepreneurial journalist. So you hear the term citizen journalist? We all know what that is. The best thing that could happen to you guys, all you graduate students who are hoping to get jobs in journalism, is for some citizen journalist to get sued for $3 million and lose. That'll take care of the citizen journalists out there who think that it's easy to go out and be journalists with nobody behind you to support you. I was the head of the investigative staff when we received a visit from a freelance journalist whose name is Florence Graves. And she was the editor of Common Cause magazine. We were skeptical about working with freelance journalists in those days. Less skeptical now than we were then, because we didn't know who these people were. We hadn't hired them. They don't have our values. But she had a pretty good story, and we throw all of our values aside when we get a good story in front of us. She had done some reporting to the point where she felt that she had several women who would talk to us about improper sexual advances that the senator from Oregon, Robert Packwood, had made toward these women. That was what she came into the building offering. Our typical way of handling that kind of a venture or partnership in those days was to assign another reporter, a Post reporter, somebody who we knew well and had hired and knew his or her values, to work with this freelancer. The Post had a sort of spotty record with this kind of enterprise. In the 80s, we had allowed a freelancer to come in and work with us on a story about the Mobil Oil Company and a man named Tavlareus. That name probably means nothing to you, but it led to one of the most celebrated libel suits of the 1980s. And the Post had essentially lost, although eventually on appeal things came out okay. But it didn't come out okay for a while, and Ben Bradley, the legendary editor of the Post, was not too fond of anybody who came to him and said, I have this freelancer who wants to work with us, because he felt that this was a blot, a stain on the Post record. On the other hand, they also had confidence in editors like myself. Okay, so it's September 20th. It's amazing I remember the exact date, but I do. September 20th, 1992. And there's a bit of a time problem here. I mean, always in journalism there's a time problem. But the election is coming up on November 4th. And so we had only that amount of time to complete the story, we felt. In addition, we didn't really have until November 4th because there was a kind of unspoken rule, which probably doesn't exist anymore, that you don't report on something that is terribly damaging to somebody's political campaign on the Sunday before the Tuesday election. That Sunday is kind of out of bounds. It has to appear by Saturday. And there's no reason why this exists, except that it's kind of the idea that you can't respond in time, that you don't have the news cycle to come back if you were treated unfairly. And as I say, it's an unspoken rule. I'm sure you come up with examples where in 1992 or earlier it was handled differently, but that was kind of our rule. I wanted people on the record. I felt that we didn't need everybody on the record. I mean, if you have, let's say, 12 examples, you don't need 12 people, but you need 3 or 4. Not only to give credibility to the story, but because it was a kind of tactic with Packwood, because one of the things is I'm not going to respond to anonymous charges. Well, here's Miss A, and here's Miss B, and here's Miss C, and they're on the record. So we all got together and we tried to decide what to do. And the question was asked and posed, do we have an obligation to the voters of Oregon to reveal what we know before the election? Well, so I'm going to throw it open to you guys. What standards would you use? What do you give a fig for this unspoken rule about, when to publish a story? What do you think? We probably would have reported what NBC reported. I'm not sure we would have even begun to do the reporting that we did that was firsthand. But I always feel like that makes us hypocritical. I mean, if we're not going to publish something because of our sensibility about things, you don't just want to wait until somebody else publishes it and then go ahead. Now, if Chuck Robb is facing an ethics investigation because of some angle here we've failed to all remember, well, that's different. Then you have an obligation because somebody is taking the action. But just to say, oh, NBC, nightly news, tomorrow morning, Washington Post knows it all too. And there often is, I mean, go back to my secrecy argument, there's often is a tie to something when you have secrets, because you got to pay for that mistress somehow, or that, you know, let's not always make it about a man with a mistress. Women can have mistresses too, right? But there's some, you know, you have to do something secret in order to keep the secrecy going, and then you begin to find those things, the misuse of, which is why I think it's more of an issue than we are willing to admit, and it's not just a matter of salaciousness. If I were to make the decision today, let's talk about that for 5 minutes, because I think that's the reason I brought it up, and we haven't really explored that. So let's imagine a situation today where it's whatever the first hint of it is, and then it's all over Twitter and the blogosphere, and we even have a discussion about why isn't the Washington Post going to publish this? That's the discussion that would inevitably occur, because the blogosphere wouldn't have the information because bloggers don't actually do any reporting. So they wouldn't be able to discuss the fact, like they wouldn't even have as much as you guys had to discuss whether we should or shouldn't publish. Instead, they would just be black and white. Post should publish. It's always, this is the typical of the Post. They always withhold stuff about Republicans. You know, they're always withholding stuff about Democrats. That would be the typical thing that we would be accused of. Or they, you know, they're too much part of the establishment. What's wrong with the mainstream media? This would be the drumbeat that we would have. And I'm not sure that we wouldn't find a way to change the calculations so that we could publish. That would be my belief today. What do you think?